Mike Van Beek. So if you don't know the Mackinac Center, thank you very much for the introduction on that. We're a free market economic think tank. Our headquarters is in downtown Midland. We've had many Northwood students have gone on to internship, and a lot of our colleagues graduated here from Northwood, so we've always had a great partnership. Our founding president was an economics professor here at Northwood, a guy named Lawrence Reed. And me and Mike are going to talk today about how states can assist in implementing Washington's free market reforms. Specifically, what are some programs that states should adopt in order to kind of move along the very important issues that are at the state level. Federal government does a lot of things, trade and immigration being big ones. States implement a lot of reforms themselves. If you go back to the early 2000s, Michigan was in the midst of a unique one-state recession. This lasted from 2002 to about 2010, 2011. We were the number one state for losses of jobs. We lost nearly 1 million jobs over that time period. About 20% of the jobs here in Michigan disappeared. Our household income in the state collapsed. It declined 25%. This was one of the worst state recessions going back about 100 years. You have to go back to the Great Depression to find state collapses that match what Michigan was going through. So a lot of that was our auto industry collapsing, but that affected everything all the way up to government employment. And so at the time, in 2007, 8, when things were really, really dire, that month, Michigan had an unemployment rate of higher than 14%. If you were graduating from college that year, you had a very minimal chance of finding a job in the career that you actually want to go to. And so you had state lawmakers looking around for ideas. How can we turn the state of Michigan around? What should we actually do? And so the Mackinac Center, we released a report we called 101 Recommendations. And the idea was to help turn Michigan around. We're going to talk about, we re-released this report here in the last year. Me and Mike spent a lot of work on it. And so what we did was we looked at kind of the main policy areas that we think that Michigan should go to. Those are our kind of top 10 or 12 that we've put together that we'll talk about. And then we have, because, we've got tons of ideas, we went on with another 90 or so. So if you want to find the full report, you can find it at the Mackinac website. We've gotten this out to different lawmakers, but we'll talk over some of the most significant ones here. And then before going on to the next speaker, and we'll hang around afterwards if you want to come up and ask us any questions. So number one is for Michigan to become a right-to-work state. This has always been on the list. So what does it mean? So right now in our country, about a little bit over half the states are what we call right-to-work states. Half are forced unionism states. So if you work for a company, and if at any time the workers at that company go through a process, and this could be manufacturing facility, it could be working at Kroger, it could be a school system, a school district, a college. If the people within a unit vote to become unionized, even if you disagree with it as an individual worker, you have no choice. You have to join up with that union, or you have to pay fees to that labor union. So my father, he had worked in the construction industry, and he joined in a unionized shop initially, and then he became a public school teacher later on, which was also unionized. So even if the union is advocating for things he disagrees with, even if he thinks that the contract they negotiate is not beneficial to him, it doesn't matter. He has to either become a member or he has to pay fees to that labor union. Right-to-work states say that this is illegal. You can't force someone to become a member or supporter of a labor union. They get the right to choose whether they want to spend their money that way. The analogy I like to use for this is like every town in Michigan has a chamber of commerce. You might think the Chamber of Commerce does great work. Northwood's member of the local Midland Chamber of Commerce. But it's your choice as a business whether you want to join or not. No Chamber of Commerce across this country can force a business to join, even if that chamber does great work for businesses. They actually have to go out and advocate and get their members to sign up and join them. And I think that a similar thing should happen for if you want somebody to become a member of your labor union. Eliminating all select subsidies, incentives, and industry-specific tax favors. If you look in the last, leading up to those really great recession years in Michigan, where we were seeing a collapse of jobs and employment, one of the things that the state was consistently doing at the time was we had hiked taxes across the board. We hiked the income tax. We hiked the cigarette tax. We hiked business taxes. We adopted what at the time was one of the worst business taxes across the nation, but only for most individuals and businesses. What the state was also doing was spending mass amounts of subsidy for just a few companies, just a couple of dozen companies. Not only paid no taxes, they were getting enormous subsidies from the state. And so what this was doing was it was locking in high taxes on everybody to just benefit a couple of companies. And surprise, surprise, we just heard from Barbara about politicians aren't necessarily the greatest about picking who are the best companies that are going to be the next big thing here in the state. And so Michigan was going all in. This is back in 2005, 2006, all in on battery companies, all in on windmill companies, all in on film studios. They were trying to pick what the next big industry was going to be. So the Mackinac Center has done analysis of these types of programs, and we have found that they are very unsuccessful. So even the best of these programs gets fewer than 20% of the jobs ever end up coming in that they project. And at the worst, most of these are wasting billions of dollars. They're going through bankruptcy. They're not coming into being at all. And that's not even talking about the indirect costs. All the companies that you had to hike taxes on, what are the jobs that they never created? When you hike the income tax, what are the families that never moved to Michigan in the first place? And so eliminating these is a better, fair tax system for everyone. We think there should be low taxes, but there should be a low flat rate on everybody across the board.
Yeah, one stat that I like about Michigan's business subsidy programs is that we spend more handing out select tax breaks and subsidies to businesses than the state collects from all the other businesses in tax revenue. So think about how silly that is. We tax all the businesses, collect their revenue, and then we hand it out even more than that to a select group of businesses who are favored for whatever reason by politicians. Third idea from this list is to pass education opportunity scholarships. You'll probably notice a theme throughout these recommendations, and that theme is that we need to inject more competition into our public policy issues. And this is probably the best example where we have public schooling system that is not competitive. And we know that innovation and dynamic improvement, that happens with competitive pressure, right? And so in our public school system, we don't have that. Public schools operate as geographical monopolies, essentially. And there is a little bit of choice that parents can have because they can choose to send their kid to the school district next door, or maybe there's a charter school in their area that they could send their child to. But the biggest untapped potential is that we have a bunch of private schools that most parents can't afford to send their kids to, even though they would like to. And those private schools would create real positive competitive pressure on the public school system to improve. There's now over half of the states in the country have private school choice programs where parents can get either a voucher or a tax credit or some sort of scholarship to support their choice of homeschooling their student or sending their student to a private school. Michigan, unfortunately, is in a really bad situation because in 1970, we ill-advisedly passed a constitutional amendment that prohibits this very thing from happening. The Trump administration and Congress right now is thinking about, there's bills in front of them right now that would do this at a federal level. And so Michigan parents could potentially benefit from that, but the state should also create its own program. And like I said, about half of the states already have these kinds of private school competitive programs. Another area where we need more competition is in our electricity market. We have set up a monopoly there as well, where the two big utility companies, Consumers and DTE, they get to command 90% of the market. It's just written right into law that way. Okay, so we only have 10% of our electricity market is competitive. And guess what has happened to electricity prices in Michigan? Does anyone know? Have you heard people complain about this, right? They've only gone in one direction in the last 2 decades, and that's up. They continue to move in that direction, and that's because we don't have competition. And the big utility companies, they make more money building wind turbines and building new solar panel farms. And so they're focused mainly on making money through that means, and which means that the rest of us pay for higher costs, not only to build all that new infrastructure, but also because the rates that they have to charge on the electricity go up as well. So this is an area where there are lots of other states who operate their electricity markets differently, and they have better rates and better prices for consumers. So even states right around us, Illinois has a more competitive market than Michigan, and you don't say that very often about things in Illinois. So that's one area we need to make a change in as well. Regulation is another big issue at the state level as well as the federal level. We know, of course, what DOGE is doing and what President Trump is emphasizing, making federal regulatory reform. But states have their own regulatory problems. In fact, in Michigan, our regulatory system is so out of control that our legislature, your elected representatives who you send to Lansing to go represent your interests, they don't have control over our regulatory environment, actually. Once they give a regulatory agency power, they can't take it away again. So we're in a real bind in Michigan because we've expanded our regulatory agencies and these administrative agencies, and it's very difficult to make them, to contract them or to rein them in. And so one of the ideas that we have is to require all new regulations to be passed by the legislature. So your elected officials have to approve of new regulations. They can't just be signed into law sort of in the dead of night when no one's paying attention, which is basically what can happen today. So this is giving back more balance of power to the legislature and making sure we can rein in Michigan what is an out of control regulatory environment. I'll take the next one. There you go.
Our next is what we call a sustainable Michigan budget. So if you look at Michigan, the next closest state to us population-wise is North Carolina. North Carolina's budget is 40% lower than the state of Michigan. And it's, despite having a budget 40% lower, they still have roads. Every ranking show their schools are just as good as ours. They have health services. In fact, it's a fast growing state where people are moving to, yet they have a much more competitive tax and spending system than Michigan does. And then the next state from that would be the state of Georgia, which has a budget 30% lower than Michigan. And so what we look at a lot is we need some level of government support. We're going to have some level of government taxation, but it's really, really hard to look across the 50 states and say, yep, the higher spending states are the ones that are delivering better services for people. A lot of times we see the opposite, and at least we see the opposite in terms of where people are moving to. And so a sustainable Michigan budget would be capping the rate of the growth in the budget at population and inflation. So if we gain a lot of population or if inflation goes up, the state budget should grow with that. But besides that, they should rein it in and rein in our spending levels. If you look at the last 5 years in Michigan, adjusted for inflation, we are spending 30% more. So we're spending 30% more this year than we were spending in 2019. Really hard to look out and say that we're getting 30% better services. Barbara drove the roads up last night, probably not saying that our roads are 30% better than Indiana or Ohio or these other states that are spending a lot less than we are. The next would be cutting the income tax rate. So Michigan has, in the last couple of decades, only hiked its income tax rate. We'd like to get it back down to 4%, which would make us competitive in the Midwest, and ultimately get it to zero. The fastest growing states across the country have an income tax of zero. That would be Texas, Florida, Nevada, state of Washington. Even there are conservative states and liberal states. Most states have cut their income tax rates the last couple of years as spending has gone up. Michigan has not. In fact, we are the only state that has increased our income tax in the last couple of years. That makes us less competitive, and we think that you can sustainably cut your tax rate, hopefully get it back down to zero, and make the state live within its means. Pork spending. So this would be where there's some legislative euphemism for what they call like in-district projects, I think is what they call it. We call it pork spending. So what this is the lawmakers will agree to the budget. What are we going to spend on our schools? What are we going to spend on healthcare? What are we going to spend on Medicaid? Things like that. And then they have this pot of money afterwards. And, you would think they would say, do we have enough money to lower the income tax or give us more competitive business tax or something? No, they figure out a way to spend it, which is in-district spending. So lawmakers will then submit a list of saying, I want to spend this money on my local Little League. I want to spend it on my local arts museum or community college. One lawmaker the last couple of years has submitted it. He wants to spend it at his private gun range where he's a member. So literally, we're just going to take money out of the budget. We're going to spend it on a private club that a lawmaker goes to. If you look at this spending over the years, you may or may not be surprised to hear whatever political party is in the majority, something like 90% of this spending goes to members of that political party. That is a heavy suggestion that they are not spending time to actually go through and say, do we actually need this money for these types of facilities? It's more of they just submit a list of spending. The money goes there. The last couple of years, it's been about $1 billion for each year. So you could eliminate most of the corporate income tax the last couple of years just by eliminating this type of spending. We believe spending should go through the legislative process. It should be debated. They should discuss it. They should say, if we want to spend money in art museums, does every art museum in the state get a chance to apply for this pool of money that we think is very important? Pork spending is not that. It's quite literally in the dead of night. Nobody pays any attention. Submit this money. Maybe the rest of the citizens find out about it 6 months later, 9 months later. But besides that, it just gets voted through. It's not a good way to spend taxpayer dollars. And then review all occupational licenses. So about 20 to 25% of workers in Michigan are required to have an occupational license to work. This includes things like that you might think of, like doctors and nurses, those in the medical profession, maybe lawyers. But increasingly over the decades, lawmakers have added occupational licenses to more working class positions. So a lot more people that are doing roofing or home building, but also barbers and cosmetologists. And you might think, well, maybe that makes sense. Maybe we need to ensure those people are operating safely, right? Maybe, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense that our barbers in Michigan are required to do more hours of training than our lawyers in Michigan. And that people who are, athletic trainers are required to do 8 times the amount of hours that EMTs are doing, even if they're operating kind of in that same area. You all go in and take classes from your local professor here at Northwood, and you can tell me afterwards how valuable you think those classes are. But most professors here at Northwood, it's illegal for them to go to the local high school and teach a class. And that's because of occupational licensing laws, where the state lawmakers would say, nah, we don't think the principal knows enough to know whether we can bring Dr. Tokarev in once a week and teach an econ class to our high school students. We're going to require them to go through and get a master's degree in education in order to, that's how valuable it is. And yet we have private school teachers who are not required to go through that. And we don't find a lot of difference in how valuable the education comes from the public versus private schools. And so our occupational licensing growth has gotten out of hand. We think there's a lot better way to look at these regulations. If you want to require permitting or inspections or something for, say, people who are doing building or decks or roofs or whatever, but requiring people to go through and sit and go through 60 hours of classes rather than an apprenticeship or something like that doesn't really make sense. And so what lawmakers should do is they should go back and review these 180 or so occupational that we have on board, look at whether it makes sense to get rid of them, look at what surrounding states do or across this, the other 50 states do, and lessen those requirements. Because as you hike the number of licenses, the economists studying this know, one, we get a lot fewer people working in that field. You cut the number of people working in that field quite a bit, and that raises prices because you have less competition for consumers. So somewhere between 15 to 30% higher prices for consumers, which makes everybody worse off.
Yeah, and just as another theme running through these policy recommendations is none of these things are what we would say outside the Overton window or are real radical kinds of policy changes. Almost all of these things are already in place or being considered being adopted in other states. So that's an additional challenge Michigan has to face, is that if we don't get our state policies right, it's very easy for people to move to other states where they have better policies, better economic performance. And so the stakes are really high for a state like Michigan to get its policies right. One of the policies we don't have right is our certificate of need requirement. Now, this is a law that requires hospitals and medical providers to get permission from the government before they expand their business, before they expand medical service provision to patients. This never really made a lot of sense. The only reason this law exists is because the federal government used to hang it out as a carrot for some federal funding. The federal government got rid of that funding, and so there actually is no need at all whatsoever for Michigan to have this law. But we maintain it because the current medical providers and hospitals like it, because it restricts competition and makes it harder for their competitors to open or to expand their businesses. So hospitals, for instance, they have to get approval in order just to add some hospital beds to a wing of their hospital, for example. Or if a medical provider wants to add a X-ray machine, they have to get permission. And the government board who makes these decisions about what medical services can be expanded is the people who are on that board are current hospital officials and other medical providers. So it is literally the fox guarding the hen house, right? These are the people who don't want increased competition. And so even during a global pandemic, we had we were rationing medical care through the certificate of need law. Now, as you can see from this map, there are plenty of states that don't have these laws, and they have just as good a medical provision as we do in Michigan here. Probably better, actually, because Michigan doesn't rank too highly on that particular subject. Number 11 of our 12 is to get rid of our outdated and antiquated alcohol regulation system. Now, it might not seem like a great idea to make it easier for people to drink alcohol, but I trust people enough that we can do that. And again, other states don't have the kinds of regulations that we have in Michigan. And when you compare them on health outcomes, even on alcohol-related health outcomes, you don't see a big difference. Michigan's alcohol regulation system was designed during Prohibition. It's over 100 years old. And it is set up to create geographical monopolies on the distribution of alcohol in some attempt to keep us safe somehow. I don't know. It never really gets explained how this is supposed to work. But what it does is it raises costs for all of us. Because these geographical monopolies don't have any competitive pressure, they can charge for different alcohol that they, basically the rates that they can get away with, essentially. So we need a more open system, a more competitive market in alcohol distribution. And the system we have now just doesn't make sense. For instance, a local brewer like the Midland Brewing Company, they could brew a keg of beer, and they couldn't sell it to a local restaurant, Frick's across the street there. They would have to go through the distribution company, which adds on its own costs, and then that would be how it would have to get a keg from the brewing company here over to Frick's here. So it's this added mandated cost into the system that we don't need. And the last one is placing guardrails on emergency powers. This used to not be in here, this presentation. We added it after 2020, and we saw what Governor Whitmer was willing to do with emergency powers. In Michigan, most people don't know, though, that in Michigan, there's lots of emergency power laws that are on the books. So there's over 30 different emergency powers that lawmakers, well, not lawmakers, that executive, the governor or a state bureaucrat, a state official, could exercise an emergency power. So we know about pandemics now, the kinds of powers that they have in the law for those, but there's also emergency powers for things like energy emergencies, for agricultural emergencies, there are workplace emergencies. There's all sorts of different emergency situations that are in the law that allow bureaucrats to exercise these tremendous unilateral powers. And the problem, of course, is that when you're in those kinds of situations, when you're in an emergency situation, it makes sense maybe for an executive to have some immediate unilateral power for a short amount of time to deal with the initial emergency. But then after that, we need to move back to the regular lawmaking process where we can get a larger group of people involved in the decision-making process and not leave it all up to a single individual. They're more prone to get it wrong in that situation than if they consult with a group or with lawmakers, elected officials. So we actually have bills already that we've written that would put in place the kinds of limits and guardrails that we need on these emergency powers. So really all Michigan needs to do is pass those bills. I don't think they will pass until Governor Whitmer leaves office, because she's not going to sign them because she was the biggest abuser of emergency powers during the COVID pandemic. So hopefully in the upcoming years, we'll be able to get that reform, but it will take a little while. That's all of them.
Thank you.
We'll be back at 10:30. Thank you for coming.